Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, Wi-Fi has become critical to every house throughout the world and has increasingly become a critical need for both consumers and enterprises. And I think we often forget that technology has needed to evolve to address these new experiences and new expectations for all. I mean, the average home could have children doing online learning. We've got the corporate Zoom or Microsoft Teams video conferencing meetings. Not to mention downloading 4K TV programs and downloading a 40 gig game to the latest games console. And that's before you talk about all the other IoT devices, Ring doorbells, smart washing machines, smart TVs. All of these things are all competing for bandwidth. Of course, Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 6E are fast becoming mainstream now, but there's also a growing need to improve performance still. And just when you thought you might have been on top of the Wi-Fi game, Wi-Fi 7 is already within tangible reach and is expected to bring next-level wireless connectivity and performance to all. So with all this in mind, I've invited Andy Davidson, Senior Director of Technology Planning at Qualcomm, to discuss exactly what is Wi-Fi 7, why it is already shaping up to be the next big thing in connectivity, and I also want to learn a little bit more about how Qualcomm is at the forefront of this new Wi-Fi evolution, and learn a little bit more about driving the standards and technology to meet the aspirations of the ever-growing customers' devices, applications, services. The list goes on, doesn't it? So enough from me. Buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to the US, where Andy is waiting to talk about Wi-Fi 7 and much more. So, a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
My name's Andy Davidson. I'm responsible for technology planning for connectivity technologies at Qualcomm. My focus is in connectivity technologies other than cellular, mainly Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Been in the Wi-Fi business for more than 20 years, originally with a startup company called Atheris that was then acquired by Qualcomm. I spent most of that time driving new features, new technologies, from working on the earliest Wi-Fi through to Wi-Fi 7 today.
Awesome. I'd love to dig a little bit deeper on Wi-Fi 7. That's a big talking point at the moment. But I always like to begin the podcast by asking a little bit more about the guests and how they got where they are today. So for yourself, I've got to ask, what was your origin story? How did the worlds of connectivity, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, etc. all collide and put you on this path you're on right now?
Well, you may have guessed I'm originally from Scotland, so, not from the US where I currently reside. Yeah. I started out working on compute and networking technologies in Scotland, and then moved to the US in 1995. Mainly worked in engineering management and R&D. I grew interested in wireless networking. Around about 1999, it seemed to me to be something that was going to be very important, and looked for some opportunities to get involved, and was fortunate enough to join Atheris, which was an exciting startup at the time that was really trying to sort of revolutionize the space by creating lower cost products when they're around at the time, and really try and drive Wi-Fi into the mass market. This was before it was known as Wi-Fi. It became known as Wi-Fi probably a year or so later.
And so much has changed over the last few years. I mean, if we go back just, 2 years ago, things like video conferencing was used by just a few people. A lot of people still felt it was a little bit awkward, and online learning and working from home was more for the privileged few more than everyone. Of course, we all know what happened next, but how have you seen usage and reliance on Wi-Fi change?
It's changed massively. If you look back to the early days, Wi-Fi was just something that was driven by people in companies who'd actually go and just set up Wi-Fi routers just for their own use, and the IT people would hunt them down and turn them off, and they would pop up again. But obviously Wi-Fi became the primary way for IT to connect those users in the enterprise. And then the home, there's a kind of similar story. It started out as just to be a router that you might put in so that in your favorite easy chair, you could connect wirelessly. But it's already grown to a point where people really wanted to use Wi-Fi throughout the home. But the last couple of years really stressed those home networks to the maximum. Everybody in the home was connected. They were doing work, school, entertainment, all at the same time, all fighting for resources. Wi-Fi kind of became a critical resource like power or water. And I think it was kind of eye-opening for a lot of users that they learned the real value of Wi-Fi, and many sort of focused on getting the best Wi-Fi they could because it was so critical to the life experience in the last couple of years.
Absolutely. And I suspect that everybody listening has come across somebody, a family member or a friend that has complained that their Wi-Fi is slow, but equally they're often blissfully unaware that games console, Zoom, online learning, and a long list of IoT devices and smart home products are all competing for bandwidth in the average home. But are you seeing customers creating separate networks to manage bandwidth better, or are we still a long way off from that?
I don't really see them creating separate networks. I think people are looking to the network products to better manage those type of scenarios that you were pointing out, and they sort of expect that to happen automatically. Wi-Fi 6, I think, was a very large step forward to manage those different scenarios because it gave the router some tools that allowed it to schedule the traffic appropriate to what the flow is, to make sure that if you've got a 4K video stream or you've got interactive video, that it got the resources it needs to succeed. Yeah. And then there's been an addition of spectrum. Round about the Wi-Fi 5 time, 5 gigahertz spectrum get added, and with the recent addition of 6 gigahertz, it really gives you the capability to move that traffic that needs the higher quality of service to the high bands, as we call them, which are 5 and 6 gigahertz, and leave the traditional 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi just to service those IoT devices. The rise of mesh networks in the market has made the delivery of that throughput you need for those big applications. It can be available anywhere in the home you want, and it's kind of regardless of size or building construction. You can get the throughput you want where you need it. So I think, in a way, home networks are becoming managed networks, but the expectation isn't that the end user has to plan them or manage them. That really the technology needs to solve the problems itself to be able to cope with this increasing number of devices, including all the smart IoT devices and the various user devices, and also be able to hit the user demands for increasing the quality of the content they're consuming.
And there'll be a lot of people listening that are already on Wi-Fi 6 or Wi-Fi 6E and feeling quite smug. But of course, there's a Wi-Fi 7 on the horizon now. So can you tell me a little bit more about Wi-Fi 7, what it is, and how it will help tackle some of the issues that we're talking about here?
So Wi-Fi 7 was tagged extremely high throughput at the IEEE that writes the standards. It could have been called extremely high throughput and reliable low latency because that's really what it is set up to deliver. There's a 320 megahertz mode, which is twice the bandwidth of today's high point of in Wi-Fi 6. So if you've got 6 gigahertz available, you can get that more capacity. But one of the biggest changes is that in prior Wi-Fi, although the router worked across multiple bands, the client would only connect on a single band. In Wi-Fi 7, the client can connect on 2 different links at the same time. And using that multi-link technology, the probability of both links being busy at the same time is much lower. So the latency becomes lower. You can find one of the 2 bands is going to be available to send your traffic. Then when you aggregate those 2 links together with high band simultaneous multi-link, you get really high throughput. And you get that high throughput at that low latency. So even if there's a lot of congestion in your network, you can still get the throughput you need for cloud gaming at the latency that you want so that, your avatar doesn't end up dead. So I think the key for Wi-Fi 7 is built to take best advantage of all the spectrum that's available today in order to give the user the experience they want.
I know it's very early days, but do you think Wi-Fi 7 is already shaping up to be the next big thing in connectivity?
I do. I think one of the best things about Wi-Fi is it's continued to evolve to solve real problems that people have. The types of problems that are maybe related to the growth in terms of the amount of devices that are using Wi-Fi, creating congestion, the end user demand for new applications with increasing requirements. I mean, 1080p video has already moved to 4K and it's going to move to 8K.
Yeah.
Cameras are capable of capturing very high quality images. So uploading and downloading those, it takes a lot of bandwidth. Interactive video, we talked about that went from being something that happened occasionally to being an everyday event for everybody. And then gaming, as gaming moves to the cloud, you really want very high throughput at very low latency. I think users have learned what lag is. They know the problems that lag causes to their gaming experience, and they want technology that solves that. And then the enterprise, you've got a kind of similar problem where a lot of applications are moving to the edge of the network. They're moving into the cloud, but to the network edge. So that last hop over Wi-Fi becomes critical to the experience, and people don't want to give up in the quality of images, and they want the latency to be imperceptible to get the same experience as if the technology was local.
And of course, for most people listening, they'll see Qualcomm as at the forefront of the Wi-Fi evolution. And I'm curious, for anyone listening that wants to take a peek under the hood or a look behind the curtain, how are you driving the standards and technology to meet these increasing aspirations of ever-growing customers, devices, applications, services? Because it's a list that keeps getting bigger, isn't it? So can you expand on that at all?
Sure. So Qualcomm is a leading contributor at IEEE, which is the standards body that creates what's called the 802.11 standard. Qualcomm's been one of the biggest contributors to that particular work group for many years. And then there's an organization called Wi-Fi Alliance. It's actually the Wi-Fi Alliance that created the term Wi-Fi. And it also manages the certification program that drives interoperability. Qualcomm's a major contributor there, and I personally serve on the board of directors of the Wi-Fi Alliance.
And I'm going to ask you to take a peek into your virtual crystal ball and ask you if there's any predictions for the future of wireless connectivity. Are there any trends or patterns that you're watching closely now?
Yeah, I would say the technology industry does a fantastic job of creating exciting new applications that just continue to challenge Wi-Fi. And that's what drives that evolution of Wi-Fi. Probably the most exciting one right now is XR. It creates a host of new challenges. I mean, in XR, lag doesn't just mean that, your avatar gets killed or you see sort of blocky video on an interactive call. It could actually make people feel queasy as the equipment doesn't work correctly for them and stop them using the product. So XR is bringing these major new challenges that the industry is going to be taking on as XR. I mean, first to make it work well, and then as it scales up with the growth of the metaverse, it's going to be how can you deliver that same experience to multiple people all in a room at the same time. I think that's going to provide opportunities for Wi-Fi innovation through Wi-Fi 8 and Wi-Fi 9, never mind Wi-Fi 7.
And is there anything that excites you about the future, and indeed the role that Qualcomm will play in that future too? Is there anything that particularly excites you?
Well, Qualcomm really exists to solve hard technical problems in wireless and beyond. That's kind of its purpose. So problems like XR, how to make it more realistic, how to scale it with multiple users in the home and the enterprise. these challenges certainly excite me, and I think Qualcomm is in a great position to go address those.
Fantastic. Now, we began the podcast today talking about your origin story, how the worlds of technology and connectivity collided for you. But as we come full circle, I'm going to ask you if there's a song, piece of music, movie, book, or anything that's inspired and helped you in your career. Is there a choice and a story you can share with us to leave the listeners on a somewhat inspirational note?
Yeah, it's a book called The Winning Spirit by Joe Montana and Tom Mitchell. Although I was in Scotland and there wasn't a lot of football available in Scotland, I did become a 49ers fan long before knowing I would one day live in the San Francisco Bay Area. So several years later, I saw this book about how learnings from sport can apply to business and life, and was probably mainly intrigued that what did Joe Montana have to say? But when I read it, I found it really insightful about collaboration. It talks about the trust in individual excellence that needs to come together in order to make an effective team. And collaboration is vital in pretty much everything we do. I would say for standards where you're bringing people across the industry together, down to the project teams within Qualcomm that are vying to create the best implementation of that standard in a product. Collaboration is really kind of the watchword for all of those types of activities.
I love that, and I'll get that added to our Amazon wish list so anyone can get their hands on that book. It sounds a great read. I'll be checking that out myself. But for anyone listening wanting to find out more information about anything we talked about today, we did cover a lot around Wi-Fi 7, and I appreciate Qualcomm is a pretty big website. So what's the best place to reach out, contact your team, or find out any extra information?
Well, you can go to Qualcomm.com, and we've got a great section there on Wi-Fi 7. I would encourage people to go visit. And then you can follow at Snapdragon on Twitter.
Excellent. Well, I'll add those links to the show notes so people can find that nice and easily. But I just want to thank you so much for sharing your story, how you got involved in the worlds of technology and connectivity, and now building the future of Wi-Fi with Wi-Fi 7. Incredibly cool. I'd love to stay in touch with you and continue talking about next generation wireless connectivity. But more than anything, just thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
As I said at the very beginning of the podcast, I think we forget how much we take the Wi-Fi for granted. And everyone's always quick to complain if the Wi-Fi is moving slow. But do not question that they now have 25 plus devices downloading 4K movies, downloading a 40 gig game on a games console, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Ring doorbells, smart TVs, smart heating, smart lighting, smart washing machines. All of these are competing for bandwidth. I'd love to know more about your challenges, how you're overcoming these challenges, and how many devices have you got connected to your router? Because if we were to go back 10 years, I would imagine most people had a handful of devices. It would have been a smartphone, maybe a tablet if you were lucky, and a laptop, or maybe 2 computers. But now, I would say there's a lot of homes got 20 plus different devices connected to their router. In fact, many of you, I suspect, have not dared to look on your router at how many connections are incoming. So I urge you all, go on now, check your router, tell me how many devices, and we'll have a bit of a straw poll, see what the average is. And as always, email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn at Neil C. Hughes. And my website is techblogwriter.co.uk, where we're approaching 2,000 interviews and 2 million downloads. It's going to be a big few months coming up. But keep those messages coming in, keep your questions, and tell me how many devices you've got connected to the internet, and we'll do it all again tomorrow. But thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.